Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Monday, November 11th. And I thought maybe we could start this one off by talking about the Amsterdam Pogrom.
Oh,
So if you've been paying attention, I'm sure you've seen it. The internet's been ablaze with the Israeli side, Zionist side, declaring that this is a pogrom in Amsterdam where
right.
Jews are being hunted. The Jerusalem Post ran the title "Jew Hunt: Rioters Planned Amsterdam Pogrom" and Telegram groups. So maybe you can explain what happened. Actually, maybe you can start with just telling us what is a pogrom, and then
okay. Well, that refers back to let's say persecution of Jews in Russia in the 19th century. That it's a very important part of modern Jewish consciousness. Of course, it took place decades before the Holocaust, but it's something that led to increased immigration, from Russia, Jewish immigration from Russia into Western Europe and eventually into the U.S. It was, essentially consisted of mobs of Russians, Russian peasants, chasing the Jews out of various towns in Western Russia. Actually, I think many of them in what's present-day Ukraine. It was obviously a very unpleasant experience for those Jews, and some, a fair number, not huge numbers, anyway, were actually killed or seriously injured, and businesses were destroyed and houses burned down. But I think it also tends to be exaggerated. It's part of it. It helps to feed the victim mentality. It was an unpleasant episode, clearly, in Jewish history, but it tends to, I think, warrant more. It receives more attention and emphasis than the actual events warrant. Let's just put it that way. So anyway, that's part of, it's almost second to the Holocaust, in crimes against the Jews. That's the way it tends to be considered. So when you're using that kind of language, it's a very alarmist language, and it's just the same thing. It's just like Jews, the eternal victims. This is happening to the Jews.
Can you tell me a little bit about the history of the pogroms? Why did they start to begin with? And you said they were kind of...
Yeah, I used to know that better, because the fact is, it's always presented as something black and white. But it's wrong to say that there wasn't any provocations, let's say, on the part of the Jewish community and bad behavior that did invite, these attacks. So I'm actually just presenting the Jewish side of it, which I think, is as accurate as far as it goes. But there is another side to it. And frankly, I used to know it better than I do now. So I'm not going to pretend to, be able to lay it all out. I know that Solzhenitsyn, this is actually a book that I really want to read. He wrote a history of Jews in Russia, which he called 200 Years Together. Now, I know Solzhenitsyn as being a very humane person. He was one of the great writers of 20th century Russia. He tries to present a nuanced picture, and I just understand, the Jews hate it in general, the Zionists hate it, because it is a nuanced picture, and it does show balance, and it shows that there were, it wasn't a black and white kind of situation. I just can't give you the details of that now.
Okay, well, maybe for a future podcast.
Yeah, no, that's a book that I want to get around to reading.
Okay, so is it fair to call what happened in Amsterdam a pogrom? Can you tell us what happened I have my own version of events that I learned just from watching videos online, but I'd like to hear your take on it.
Well, yeah, clearly it was there were just innocent Jews walking down the streets of Amsterdam, and then completely unprovoked, they just got mobbed by a bunch of hooligans just because they were Jews.
You need to work on your sarcasm.
Okay, I know. I'm not very good at it. All right. No, I saw that's what of course, what the headlines, and you quoted one of them, and there were many headlines and statements by politicians like Geert Wilders of the Netherlands. They all imply that, right? But that's not the story. And I think maybe you can give us the true story.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've been hearing a bunch of different things. So, first, before they even arrived to Amsterdam, there was stories saying that Mossad was coming with them for protection. So already there was a little bit of tension. So people were aware that Mossad was coming, right? And then during the game itself, I guess there was a minute of silence for the victims of the Spanish flood in Spain that killed many people.
Right.
And during this time, the Israeli soccer fans, I think the team is called Maccabi or something, Maccabi Tel Aviv, but they were jeering and hooting and being very disrespectful during this moment of silence. And I think that maybe because they're not big fans of Spain, because Spain has sort of put through its hand with the Palestinian side, recognized Palestine as a state. And then afterwards there were the soccer fans, Israeli soccer fans. They were chanting songs saying, let the IDF F the Arabs, and a song that I guess said something like there are no more schools in Gaza because there are no children. Things like this. Obviously pretty provocative stuff. Tearing down, there's videos of them tearing down Palestinian flags, and then reports of them attacking some Muslim taxi drivers. I'm not fully sure on all this. I actually watched an interesting video. I think it was called it's a 12-year-old Dutch boy running around the Netherlands, and he followed this whole thing. And there's no mainstream media, but there's this 12-year-old Dutch boy with asking questions and interviewing. So you kind of can follow the whole event. The mob of Israeli soccer fans. They went by a construction site. They all picked up lead pipes and tore apart pallets and boards. So you can see that there were just these roaming gangs through Amsterdam, and nobody was really doing anything about it. There's like 2 police cars kind of watching it, and then it got out of hand. And then you see some videos of Muslims that jump them and say say free Palestine, things like this. It's all a bit kind of messy in my head, but that's more or less what I saw happen. So
yeah. Well, yeah, there clearly were some extreme provocations on the part of the Israelis. They were not innocents. They clearly brought this down upon them. But then of course, there's a significant part of the West, and especially the Western establishment, that learned one lesson from World War II, and that Jews are the eternal victims. So whenever there's some sort of conflict involving Jews, the Jews are automatically the victims, and you condemn the other side. That's what happens. So that's what politicians in the West and failingly did after these incidents. I heard the Israelis sent 2 planes actually to bring back their fans.
Right. I feel like the problem with this is it's going to lead to an increasing polarization. You're going to have the Zionist camp say this is more proof that we are the eternal victim, that people are attacking us because we're Jews, and you see the titles that are being run in Israel saying that Jew hunt, that using the word pogrom. And so there's going to be more of that victim mentality. Whereas a big part of the world, this will actually just feel more of that, like, well, we can't trust Israel. They started this. They just try to paint themselves in this one light. So it's going to cause this further divide. And I think in the long run, it's going to be damaging to Israel. The more they play this victim card, it's just not carrying the same weight that it used to. People are much more aware, especially when it doesn't take much to kind of see what was happening, that this wasn't completely innocent, that there were provocations, that they were tearing down Palestinian flags. They did attack people. They were chanting, F the Arabs. And they were walking around in gangs looking for a fight, it looked like, picking up pipes, So there was clearly...
Well, that's like half the reason of being a soccer fan in Europe, as I understand, is you go to other cities and look for fights. I mean, the British soccer fans were famous for that back in the 70s and 80s. They were, there were some very violent incidents. Actually, there was one incident where I think something like 30 people were killed. It was because some structure collapsed in a stadium. It was the British hooligans were pushing against it and knocked it over and ended up killing like 30 people. But anyway, it's just, it's soccer and violence are very much associated with each other. Let's just put it that way.
Mm. Well, I think this also just leads to kind of just a larger issue that Israelis are going to be facing, is that they aren't really welcome anywhere when they travel now. Like we've said it again and again, that Israel's become the most hated country in the world. Europe is kind of supposed to be their playground. They have ties to Europe. Yeah. That's where they travel to.
Right.
And now they have to be realizing and feeling that, like, hey, we're not welcome here either. Mm-hmm. And you're hoping that will give maybe some self-reflection to the Israelis.
No,
maybe something.
Well, one thing though, it must be pointed out, the people that were dealing out the punishment, let's say, to the Israeli soccer fans were Moroccans, as what I understand it. When I first heard it, I said, man, okay, maybe the Dutch had developed a spine or whatever. But I was imagining, tall Dutch beating them up. And maybe there were a few who joined in, but it was the Moroccans.
Mm. So do you think that it is the case, though, now where Israelis don't feel comfortable traveling so much anymore because of what's happening?
I'm sure, yeah. I'm sure that's true. I think in general, especially if they keep a low profile and don't pull down Palestinian flags and chant death to Arabs or anything like that, they'd be fine in most countries, especially in Europe, and definitely in the United States. But I imagine that now there's a real hesitation when somebody in one of those countries asks you in a friendly manner, "Oh, where are you from?" They may just lie. I think.
Right. Yeah, and it makes me think about what will happen when this is all over, because I think that you're in the same position as I am, that there is really no way out for Israel with this. That this will lead to a very, very, very damaged Israel, or really to the destruction of Israel. And we've already seen many Israelis leave the country. I think we're going to see a lot more leave before this is all said and done. And if Israel does no longer exist as Israel is today, this Jewish ethno-supremacist state, what will happen to all these Israelis? Where will they go? Will they be able to be welcome? Will they all come to the United States? Because that seems to be the one country that seems to be more or less still Zionist.
Germany and Britain, I think, is fair to say, though. Yeah, I think there's more dissent within their population. Yeah, but the U.S. in general, right, the population tends to be very Zionist. But then, in places like New York, the kind of places that traditionally host immigrants, there is a lot of ill feeling towards Israel. I mean, there is a pretty powerful, pro-Palestinian community in the large cities of the U.S. That they can still do. Obviously, there are plenty of places they can go in the U.S. and do just fine. And I think in Europe too. I don't think that they're going to have any problems, finding homes and establishing communities in the West.
I'm just wondering if things really get out. I mean, this Gaza and genocide, it keeps going on, and the ICJ finds these rulings. It's going to be hard. There's supposed to be some type of process. Like, after World War II, people were prosecuting Nazis for, up until now, basically, right? There's still sometimes trials that you read in the news that
100-year-old ladies getting
right. Yeah. And I'm wondering, will there could potentially be the same thing that Israel might face? That if it is faced with just such overwhelming evidence of a genocide, which we have so much evidence, and it continues going on, and maybe this conflict goes to a point where Israel uses a nuclear weapon, there has to be some type of consequence for this, for the people living there in some regards. I'm not saying that they need to all be brought to the International Criminal Court or something, but I'm just thinking about how this could potentially play out for Israelis in the future.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting question. I don't know, but I think they're going to be plenty of sanctuaries. Yeah, they're going to. Much of the world is and will be very hostile to Israel, and by extension to the Israelis. and they're just not going to be comfortable. And I think in most countries of the world, but I think they're going to continue to be sanctuaries in the West and places where they're going to be spared, unless there's a true revolution, in places like the U.S. and Zionism is overthrown in those countries as well. Zionism may continue to persist in the U.S. even after Israel disappears. I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, what would that really? I mean, it wouldn't have legs, no power, just an idea in their minds, right?
But it may say we need to go back and start all over again. I'm sure there will be people making that argument.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. Well, maybe we can talk a little bit about just what's happening right now in Palestine, Israel. Because I haven't had many updates recently from Gaza and Lebanon. I've been hearing a few stories. I see sometimes things on Twitter saying that there are Hamas members surrendering in mass in northern Gaza, and I think this is just pure propaganda.
I don't think there's anything to that. No, I think that's completely false.
Okay, and then I also saw...
I think actually, the fighting continues with the same intensity as before. We're just not getting the reports, and the suffering continues with the same intensity as before. But again, we're just not getting the coverage. The world press has been distracted by the elections and the possibility of a strike from Iran and, other matters, and, North Koreans and Russia and that kind of thing, all those really, really important stories that they need to follow. Gazans continue to die, Hamas continues to put up resistance. And in southern Lebanon, it seems that the IDF continues to fail. They just have not gone anywhere. They're still fighting right at the border.
Right. Well, I heard that now under the new defense minister, the plan is to expand the operations in southern Lebanon.
I don't know if that would make sense, right? I wouldn't be surprised.
But I mean, in terms of what's happening there, there's really no headway. I mean, how are the IDF suffering many losses? I've seen lots of buildings being blown up in southern Lebanon.
That's what they're good at, blowing up civilian buildings. We know that. And maybe part of their plan is just like to create a Gaza, a complete moonscape in southern Lebanon. And then they would just find that easier to monitor and control. Maybe that's what they'll succeed in doing. It's just blowing up a lot of things, but they're not going to be able to hold the territory. They're going to suffer a lot of losses in the process.
We've talked a lot about the munition issues with the United States and producing things, but it seems like one thing that we don't ever have a problem producing are these dumb bombs, these 2,000-pound dumb bombs.
There's plenty of those, right?
There doesn't seem to be any issue with that production because it seems like Israel just can drop bombs all day long, 24/7, and there's no shortage, right?
Yeah,
so as far as
that seems to be true. I haven't heard any discussion of that. I guess because there's just no concern. We must have a huge stockpile. Actually, like the Russians have had a huge stockpile of dumb bombs from the Soviet era, and what they've done is they've converted them into these glide bombs, which have been extremely effective. But they're just still the bombs are still dumb over there in Palestine, meaning that they're not precisely targeting anything. They're just taking out entire neighborhoods and apartment blocks.
We have the ability to make them precise if we wanted to spend the time, right?
Right.
From my understanding, it's basically kind of a kit that's attached to the bomb.
Yeah, it seems to be fairly simple. Right.
That allows it to be guided with great precision, over a short distance, so that way you can.
Or even a fairly long distance. I mean, some of them, 50 kilometers or more. Depends on the weight of the bomb.
Okay, well, another headline that I saw regarding the Gaza-Palestine conflict is from a CNN headline that said, Qatar agrees to kick Hamas out of Doha following U.S. requests, sources say. So that now Hamas has to leave because they have been... Anthony Blinken warned Hamas that they didn't halt the war in Gaza, then they're going to be kicked out. So now they're kicking them out. So do you know anything about this, and if that has any impact on the conflict at all, or?
Right. I think it has zero impact because the negotiations were not going anywhere. there was no hope because Israel was not interested in achieving a ceasefire. Netanyahu, was not. Now, there are some people in Israel, those are the protesters, who do want a deal of some sort. They do want a ceasefire that will bring the hostages home. But Netanyahu has made it clear in so many ways through words and actions over the last, ever since October 7th, that he has no interest, absolutely no interest. So the whole thing was a charade. Yeah, now, I don't know why Anthony Blinken, set this particular deadline, but it doesn't make a bit of difference.
So where would Hamas go? Are they welcome in other neighboring countries? Are they quite popular, I imagine, in most of the Middle East?
Right? Oh, yeah. Well, I don't know. Obviously they'd be very welcome in Iran or Syria or a number of places. It's interesting. I think we should point this out that when the Arab Spring happened, there were a lot of these uprisings, some democratic, but then in many countries, jihadists quickly took over, as in Syria. And Hamas actually joined the jihadists. They were major supporters, and I think sent soldiers there to fight alongside the jihadists, the Al-Qaeda types and their allies, against the Syrian government, but also against Hezbollah. They actually fought Hezbollah and killed Hezbollah soldiers. And I think it just shows really the magnanimity, the greatness of spirit of actually Hezbollah, that, when they didn't hold a grudge against Hamas. They would have every right to do so. But when October 7th happened, and then and that was followed by the Israeli invasion and the genocide, they quickly stood by and made clear that they were a supporter of Hamas. And in fact, they put, they're one of the very, very few groups that backed up their words with real action. They began to fire the rockets into northern Israel. But, it's easy to forget that episode. There was a time when Hamas was a lethal opponent of the Axis of Resistance. But they've been, that's all forgotten, and they're embraced and supported by the Axis of Resistance now.
Yeah, I actually remember that because I was in Palestine when that happened. This was I was there in 2013, I believe, or something around then. And I was staying with it was just a Palestinian family in the West Bank, and I remember talking to the father, and he said he was leaving to fight Bashar al-Assad in Syria. He was going up there, and I had no idea what was going on. I was just a young kid, and I was like, I barely understood the conflict at the time, and I was like, this seems weird. You have a wife and 2 kids here, and you're going to leave to go fight in Syria. But I do remember that was a real thing, and then I have thought about that before, and now it's like the Hezbollah, the Axis of Resistance, is in support of Hamas when, like you said, they were actually against it. I never fully understood why. Was it just a Sunni Shiite thing, or?
Yeah, well, I mean, the Sunni Shiite divide was very real, and that had been for decades, centuries. One thing is people forget that Al Qaeda. We always think about the Western victims of Al Qaeda. But most of their violence was actually directed against Shia. I would say, like, for every Westerner that was killed, probably 100 Shia Muslims were killed. And so they were the spearhead of the attack against the Shia. And of course, Saudi Arabia and Iran were enemies. And in general, there was an effort, led by Saudi Arabia, to isolate and maybe even bring down, the Iranian regime. But that's past. I mean, it's not, there's, we can thank China in part, for mediating the reconciliation between Iran and Saudi Arabia. They buried the hatchets, and they are cooperating. A lot of people said, well, this can't be for real, but it seems to be for real. It really, so that, thanks to these mediation efforts, but then also, I think it's quite serious. The conduct of the Axis of Resistance has won lots of friends among the Sunni communities throughout the Middle East. they see that it's actually the Shia that are fighting on behalf of Hamas and on behalf of the Palestinians. They're the ones who that are acting and are not just talking. Meanwhile, Erdogan goes on, with his fiery speeches, and the Saudi Arabian government makes statements. And actually, I heard just the other day, maybe it was today, they, for the first time, used the word genocide to describe what Israel was doing in Gaza. They're making statements, Saudi Arabia, right? So, but they're not backing up their statements with any kind of action. But the Shia are, the axis of resistance is, and Sunnis around the Middle East see that. And I think that if they had some sort of animosity, or suspicions of the Shias, it's gone, and they regard them as heroes, and they now stand shoulder to shoulder.
Yeah, it is fascinating that it's the Shiite world that is standing up for the Sunnis in Palestine.
Yeah,
the people forget that the Palestinians are Sunni Muslims, and it's the Shiites that's for some reason are the only ones, and all the Sunni countries are. I guess essentially that's just evidence that the U.S. Israel threw their hat in with the Sunni camp, and we were trying to. And that's what we do. We want to destabilize the region, so we keep that Sunni Shiite divide going as long as we can. And want to make sure that they're in conflict with each other. We had what Saudi Arabia was doing to Yemen, backed by the United States. That's the Shiite-Sunni conflict. When Iraq invaded Iran, same thing. All these, and now that game's over. The divide, that Sunni-Shiite divide, is been healed. Like I said, thanks to the honor of the Shiites, the way that they're standing up for the Sunni brothers, and doing so, I think, quite honorably, trying to avoid civilian casualties, while also while civilian casualties are being inflicted heavily on these populations in Lebanon and in Gaza, of course. So I think that means that the game is kind of up for Israel at this point, even if, let's say, everything stops and somehow everybody just forgets what happens the past year or two. The fact that the Sunnis and Shiites aren't being pitted against each other just changes the whole landscape for the Middle East, for the United States, and, of course, Israel, most importantly. Would you agree?
Yeah, no, I do agree. I mean, it's a major shift. It was a very important development. I remember when the announcement was made, like a year or two ago, about the healing of the rift between Saudi Arabia and Iran. That was joyful news, but it was kind of, the announcements were very somber. like in the U.S. there wasn't any rejoicing. Hey, peace is breaking out. And they say, peace is breaking out. Oh no, this is because obviously this went against U.S. interests. They were in favor of that divide, and they helped to stoke it, and the Israelis did too. So this was for them a major defeat.
Right, but we shouldn't even say U.S. interests. It was against Israeli interests. And
we
ourselves to those interests.
I think that's true. I mean, it essentially is true. But Israel, and by extension the U.S., you could say.
Do you see any sign of these Sunni countries doing more? No. I mean, Saudi Arabia, at least they said they're using the word genocide. At least,
right. I mean, they have moderated their policies. I mean, prior to October 7th, there was a chance of complete normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and I think some of the other Gulf states with Israel. That's off the table. They have, hardened their positions. And then, during the recent Israeli attack on Iran, they would not allow the Israelis to use their airspace or their bases in this country. So that's a shift, and that's significant. But they're not, Turkey in particular could really hurt Israel. Again, we've talked about that. If they cut off the oil to Israel, that could bring the whole war machine there to a halt. But Erdogan is just such a snake that he's not going to do it. It may get to the point where he's faced with a revolution in his own country, and that's what may happen in the other Sunni countries, because the Sunni people, by and large, are seething. They're very much on the side of the Palestinians, and they're very unhappy with their rulers. And so far that hasn't translated into real action against the rulers. It's hard, if you don't. You may have the numbers, but you don't have the army, you don't have the organization, you're still powerless. And I think that's what most of the people are finding. But there may be a coup somewhere. The dam may break, and we may find Sunni governments starting to fall and, to join the axis of resistance. We're certainly not there yet. There's no signs of it, but I could see it happening somewhere down the road.
Right. I mean, we see I think everybody's waiting to see what Iran does. And then the response from Israel, that could start to lead
I think, part of it is just, these governments live in fear of Israel for good reason. Jordan would be the best example. But if Iran can demonstrate its military superiority over Israel, that could change things. That will change their calculations.
Yeah. Okay, well, we'll see. Is there anything else in the Middle East that you'd like to cover? Any big news?
No, I can't think of anything offhand.
Okay, I'd like to go over to Ukraine, Russia, or actually even before that, just talk about NATO a little bit, because in the last podcast you were talking about, one of the things that Trump said in 2016 that was popular was you said like, oh, what's the point of NATO?
Right.
And you were like, he's right. What is the point of NATO? Right, that we should just get rid of NATO. NATO should be disbanded. I think. Can you help explain why ending NATO would be a good thing? Because I think a lot of people, when they hear that, they're like, well, NATO, it's an alliance. These are our allies. It's normal for countries to have an alliance, and it's good for us. It shows that we're united and we're strong and we're together. Why should NATO be ended? Why is it why should?
Well, again, it did serve a purpose during the Cold War. The Soviet Union was clearly an adversary, an ideological adversary, and a very powerful one that had a conventional army that could, very easily overrun Europe. And I don't think there was ever any great risk of that. But there was that potential, there was that capability, right? And so it was a true defensive alliance. It did not, it was when there were, for example, there was unrest within Warsaw Pact countries, such as in Hungary in the 1950s or Czechoslovakia in the 1960s. NATO and the West in general did not become involved. The Russians went in and put down those rebellions, and that was that. It was truly a defensive alliance, but it is no longer a defensive alliance. It's been expanding. In Serbia, it chose sides in a civil conflict, and it attacked Serbia. The Serbian government peeled off a territory, that's Kosovo. Very much an offensive operation. It engaged in offensive operations in a regime change operation in Libya. Again, this was not defensive. It was used for regime change, with really disastrous consequences in Libya. So, and then the raison d'être, the reason for its existence is no longer there. There is not a Soviet Union. Russia has neither the intent nor the capability to actually threaten Europe. I mean, it has, again, you get all this rhetoric, after Ukraine, it's going to be, Poland, and then they're going to take over, they'll be in the streets of London, in a couple of years. And it's just total nonsense. They don't have that capability. They don't have that interest. Ukraine is a unique case. They pretend to be surprised by it, like this was completely unprovoked. But Russia all along was saying, hey, Ukraine, we've put up with all this. Like, you lied to us and you expanded eastward. You took Poland, you took, all these countries, the Baltic states. You said you wouldn't do it, but we just accepted it. But Ukraine is not acceptable. And they made that crystal clear, and the Americans knew it. The Americans knew that this was a red line, and they rejected it. So there's never been any intention, nobody can point to, or the ability to actually to threaten Europe as a whole. Russia was always looking for just a buffer state, say, please stop before you get to Ukraine, and they wouldn't even promise to do that. So this is it's just a completely different situation. You know, this is not, first of all, it's not a defensive alliance. It does engage in offensive operations. And that's why, you know, why Russia doesn't want it on its borders. You know, it is a real threat to them. And if Ukraine had been brought into NATO, you know, again, with the hotheads, the ultranationalists that are in Ukraine, they could very easily provoke, you know, attack Russia and provoke a war, and then immediately all of NATO would be brought in. And so Russia said, you know, we just can't have that kind of danger on our borders.
Right. Well, why is Russia okay with countries like Finland, for example, joining NATO, or we have Estonia, Latvia? These are all bordering Russia as well.
Yeah, well, they're not really okay with it. They're not happy about that. It does create problems for them. But Ukraine is a special case. I mean, first of all, Ukraine is historically the territory through which Western invaders have invaded Russia. You know, that's the way the Napoleon came and the Nazis came, and so there's that. And then Ukraine is just so much larger. So that was just, it was, you know, they're not happy with any of it. They weren't happy with Poland, you know, they're not happy, or with Romania or anything, but it's just that Ukraine is the bridge too far. And that's what they made clear from the beginning.
Right. I mean, you say Russia doesn't have the capability to threaten Europe. Well, it does in the sense that it has nuclear weapons, right?
Oh yeah, well, so, of course.
I mean,
no, of course. But it just can't. But it doesn't have a conventional army, you know, that could actually invade such a large territory and occupy it. I mean, it's
right.
It's going to be a strain on its resources to even occupy, you know, like half of Ukraine.
Right. Well, I think it's also just so important now, especially in the modern age where we have the internet, to win public opinion. I think that is really important, and it's very hard to have the same propaganda narrative machines that we had in the past. I mean, they can try. I mean, we still, I'm surprised actually how effective they still are.
They still are very effective. Yeah.
Right, but not as effective as they used to be. People are breaking away slowly, and there are people that are in their ideological bubbles, clearly. But I think if you are clearly an expansionist power that is just hell-bent on taking territory and cleansing the land, it's very hard to win over that public opinion support. So I think that's one of the big constraining things. And I think that's a big mistake with Israel right now that it's doing, that it's just clearly just wanting to create this greater Israel and just wants to ethnically cleanse the land of Palestinians, and everybody can see it. And the more that it's trying to do it, even though it has a huge, you know, conventional media behind it, it's running into the fact that, hey, this is the 21st century. You can't just do this completely. But the fact that, you know, that Russia does have all these nuclear weapons, you know, it's just more proof that you want to keep a buffer zone between you and Russia. Right. So while you don't want Finland, you don't want these countries on your border that are ideologically opposed to you or have the intention of dismantling you. You want that buffer zone. It's just going to be safer for everybody. Don't keep two nuclear armed powers just right next to each other that clearly have beef, you know?
Right. Yeah. No. It's just as a practical question, right? It just makes buffer zones, you know, neutral countries make a great deal of sense. Again, we used to be much more practical about this. Back when the Soviet Union, again, clearly was our ideological adversary. That they represented a different social system. I guess now, you know, Russia it's a completely different set of ideologies, but today, but back then there was no question about it. You know, they were our ideological adversary. They were our enemy, and but we were in favor. For example, I think Eisenhower was very happy when Austria chose neutrality. He thought it was actually good for the West. It would reduce tensions, you know, if we had these neutral zones along the border.
So do you believe that NATO should just be disbanded completely, or that we should maybe retract NATO to, you know, what it used to be originally?
I think it needs to just be torn down. It's turned into this, you know, just an instrument of globalism and of U.S. domination of Europe. I think, the Europeans should understand that actually it's not Russia that's threatening them. It's the U.S. It's not Russia that blew up their pipeline. It was the U.S. It's not Russia that dictates to them, what they can do and what they can't do. And, with horrible economic consequences, it's the U.S. And the U.S. dominates them, through NATO in large part. So they should just get rid of NATO. The Europeans, if they had any sense, and there, again, there are dissident political parties that see this, but all the ruling parties in Europe are, with the exception, of course, of Hungary and Slovakia, don't see it. They prefer to be vassals.
Do Europeans want to get rid of NATO? I feel like NATO
I'm
is
sure some of them
popular.
do. I don't know I haven't seen recent polls. I don't know what it is. I'm sure there's probably a fairly large fraction of the population that wants to see NATO go. I just don't know what the percentage is.
Yeah, I think a big problem that the United States has in terms of preserving its hegemony and its control over Europe is that America is no longer cool and hip. If you think about America back in the day, let's say in the 90s or even earlier 80s, when it was good to be associated with the United States. This was the country of blue jeans, McDonald's, Star Wars, rock and roll. We were objectively cool. And now I feel like that mask has kind of fallen off, and we don't look cool at all. We look evil, perverted, stupid, demented. Supporting genocide. It's just people don't want to be associated with us as much anymore, and I think that has a huge undermining effect on.
Yeah, I think in the long run it really does. I think there's no question about it.
Right, because now it's not so people don't want to be associated with the U.S. as much in Europe. It's easier to be like, America doesn't seem that cool. I think a lot of it actually really has to do with our support of Israel. I think that's probably been more damaging to us than anything.
Yeah, right. Yeah, there's no question about it.
Well, so, okay, I think you explained pretty well why NATO doesn't really serve a purpose. It's not, the purpose is to keep Europe under the heel of the United States. The purpose is to preserve U.S.-led hegemony. So do you think that NATO can be disbanded or destroyed? Trump voiced those sentiments. Yeah. Do you think there's a possibility?
No,
or
I don't see it happening, anytime soon. Name one bureaucracy that was dismantled. For example, in the U.S., I remember when Reagan came to power in 1980. One of the planks in the Republican platform was abolish the Department of Education, abolish the Department of Energy. They're still standing. It's just like these institutions, they never go anywhere. They only get bigger. And that seems to be the general law of bureaucracy. It just
eventually
expands.
they collapse under their own unwieldiness.
You have to go finally to, it's just sort of like there are tumors on the host body, and the tumors just keep on getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually they kill the host. I guess that's what happens. But
do you see that happening with NATO? Obviously, if Russia is clearly defeating NATO in Ukraine. This is a war between Russia and NATO, and we're just using Ukrainian lives for this. And we've expended most of the Ukrainian lives, which is just horrific.
Yeah.
But once that's done, won't NATO have to have some? Isn't that going to shake up NATO? Isn't there going to be some kind of restructuring?
Yeah. It may very well. I know people say that, this is the end of NATO. I tend to think the opposite, that it'll just strengthen NATO, or at least its hold on what, on Europe. They'll ring the alarm bells and say, we were unprepared. We need to double in size. We need to triple our budgets. We need to hire 10,000 more people for our headquarters in Brussels or wherever. And I think that's more likely what's going to happen. I mean, the only way NATO is going to go is that if some of these truly anti-globalist parties start winning elections in major countries like Germany and France, and that might and they stay true to their principles, they could bring about the end of NATO. But I don't see it happening.
Well, I mean, yeah, you say that maybe they'll just want to double down and expand and pump more money into it. But you've also told me before that, how they talk about Russia being this existential threat and they're going to roll into Europe, but you don't see countries raising their defense budgets. Yeah. They're not making any. You just told me last Friday that, with Germany, that the reason the government fell apart, the coalition government fell apart, is because one of them said, we don't have the money to give more money to Ukraine to keep this going. So I just don't. I think the economics are coming to a head with NATO expansion as well, or NATO budget.
Well, no, it's true. There are constraints, and there's a question, like I've said all along, about how real this hysteria and panic. Just like in the U.S., we're talking about prior to the election of Donald Trump. All these people are saying, that democracy itself is at stake. He's a fascist, et cetera, et cetera. So you really believe that, and you probably should carry out a coup. And maybe there are some people who still really believe that, and they might attempt a coup. That could still happen. But I just noticed how quickly, like the New York Times, they were making those kind of statements right up until the day of the election. And after that, they immediately moderated their tone. It's like, okay, well, that act didn't really work out too well. Let's adopt a new pose. And I think that's true of most people. So, it's the same thing in Europe. There's all this anti-Russian hysteria, but they, as you pointed out, they have not been backing it up with real financial, commitments. Or, up to a point they have. Let's be honest. They've given them a lot of money, but there are obviously limits. If they really thought like the existence of Europe was at stake, they would be forking over much more, and they wouldn't be worrying about budget constraints and so on, just as you're saying. Now, if Russia achieves a major victory, still Russia is moving slowly. Clearly, they're winning this war, and they are pulverizing the Ukrainian army. And the southern Donbass, the Ukrainian front there is in a state of collapse. But it's still, like if you look at the larger map, it's just not quite obvious what's going on. But at some point, the Russians will break through completely, and they'll just start marching to the Dnieper, and then maybe they'll cross the Dnieper, and they'll start marching on Odessa. And we'll just see what happens at that point. Maybe the hysteria will become real. Maybe the panic will become real, and it might be backed up by some, something substantial, troops on the ground. That's what or major investments in NATO. It remains to be seen. It remains to be seen.
Yeah, I mean, the Europeans have to be upset. I mean, I would like to hear, if you guys are living in Europe, put in the comments what people are feeling, how they're thinking about what's going on right now, because the Europeans are bearing the brunt of this war. The Americans, this is our war, but we're not suffering the consequences of it.
Right.
Our energy prices haven't increased, but in Europe, what they've gone up like 3 to 5 times, and manufacturing in Germany has completely fallen apart. I just wonder, how can the Europeans be okay with this for so long? At some point, the truth is going to come through that this is the United States that is destroying Europe, not Russia. It's the U.S. that is that blew up the pipeline, that is forcing this conflict to go on with no real plan. And then when we leave, we're just going to let Europe pick up the pieces, I guess, right? I mean, there has to be... Can you talk about the situation in Europe right now, just the economy? How bad is it for Europeans right now for the...
Right. Well, it's quite bad. I know that the British economy is just in tatters. It's it hasn't grown at all, I think, over the last few years. But the powerhouse of the European economy, of course, is Germany. That's really been the EU. When you look at EU economic figures, it's really Germany that you're looking at. Germany is what has made the EU, and Germany is really suffering. I think everyone's heard that Volkswagen, for the first time ever, is shutting down factories within Germany. I think they're shutting down 3 or 4. And that is a serious blow to the German economy. You know, there's going to be all kinds of secondary effects. I mean, again, there's all, you know, for every factory that's shut down, there are going to be so many suppliers of parts and other services that are going to shut down. There's going to be a cascading effect. Germany is de-industrializing, and I think the consequence, the overall impact of that cannot be overstated. It really means the end of European economic growth and vibrancy. You know, Europe is going to see, used to be, you know, one of the major economic centers of the world. That's why the G7 dominated the world. It was the US, Japan, and Europe, basically. Japan has been kind of, you know, still a major economy, but it hasn't grown really very much at all in the last few decades. And Europe is fading. I mean, it's part of this general decline, you know, of the G7. But anyway, Europe needs to wake up and you know, and reconsider, you know, the course that it's chosen, and maybe reconsider its allies. Again, it might do a lot better with, you know, joining hands with Russia. I think that's the natural economic partnership, right? And that's what they had. That was a lot of what powered Europe over the last few decades. Or, you know, again, cheap energy and other commodities from Russia, but then all kinds of investment opportunities within Russia. Now, they haven't abandoned that entirely. Like when I was in Russia, you could still see it. There was quite a European presence, but it's been greatly reduced. They've lost a lot of money there. You know, German companies, I think in particular, a lot of manufacturing companies have lost a great deal of money. You know, they had some very large projects in Russia, and those were shut down.
I think if Germany restores relations with Russia, that they will be able to turn their economy around rather quickly.
Yeah, you know, it'll take some time, but I think that that's a fair statement. I mean, it just seems obvious to me that was a beneficial partnership. You know, that was, you know, economic relations are all about mutual benefit, and it was a mutually beneficial relationship. And I remember at the time when the sanctions were announced, I thought it was going to do some real harm to Russia, and it only did temporary harm. But at the same time, it said, like, you know, every time you have some kind of economic transaction or relationship, the reason that economic relationship exists is because it's mutually beneficial. So if Europe is severing these ties, they're obviously hurting themselves too. I mean, that's just sort of a law of economics. And it just seemed like this was rather bizarre. You know, who are they punishing? They're obviously choosing to punish themselves. And it turned out that actually those relationships were much more important to Europe than they were to Russia. But the fact that it was going to hurt Europe should have been obvious to anybody with some sort of grasp of economics. But clearly these people, you know, the people who lead Europe either don't understand economics. I think that's true of a lot of them, or it's just that they completely lost their reason. You know, they just, they were caught up in this hysteria, and rational thinking was the first victim.
Right. I feel like it's inevitable then. I mean, these economic forces will eventually pull Europe and Russia back together, how they should be. And the U.S. has essentially driven this temporary wedge between them. But I don't see it lasting forever. As things get worse for the Europeans, and we'll see how this winter goes. I mean, this is where energy prices, people really start to feel it. It just seems like we will have. I see the outcome being that we will turn Europe against the United States. You know, even Western Europe.
It may eventually happen. I mean, that's the objective reality. And again, it's just the the establishment parties are just deeply invested in this other interpretation of events, but it's a false reality that they've invested themselves in, and it cannot last. They cannot maintain this fiction that they're hysterically maintaining now.
Right. Yeah, it's unbelievable. Just this fiction that we're living in, and how long can it go? It has to collapse.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think we can end it there, Dad.
Sure.
All right. Enjoy your time in California.
Okay.
And have a good rest of your day.
Yeah, you too.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.